Hey everyone, welcome to another one of our videos. Today we're going to be doing a full throttle body replacement on my 2002 Lexus GS300. Same process, same exact part should apply for I believe any of the 01 or at least later 01 to 05 GSs. The earlier ones I believe have a different throttle body part, but the process will probably be pretty much the same. And the reason I'm doing this is because one or both of these sensors, our accelerated pedal position sensor and our throttle position sensor, failed on my car. And in addition to those, I also have, after going through a diagnostic procedure of taking resistance and impedance readings of these sensors, the motor reading out of spec as well. So whenever you add those parts all up together, it comes out to basically the same price or possibly a little bit cheaper to replace the entire throttle body as opposed to replacing the sensors individually. This one's around 400 bucks, the motor's around 400 bucks. This sensor's fairly cheap. This one you can get for around 100 bucks, but whenever we add up the entire thing and the entire throttle body with a brand new casting, everything's about 1,000 bucks. It makes more sense, at least to me, to go with the entire throttle body. You can also get remanufactured ones if you're working on a little bit of a budget on eBay and whatnot, so there's some options out there for you. But this is a brand new OEM Toyota, OEM Lexus replacement part that we're going to throw in the car, and hopefully this resolves all of our problems. So we're going to go ahead, head over to the car. Should be a pretty easy and straightforward process, just a little bit of removal of items, and go ahead and get this thing replaced. So see you at the car. All right, so the first step in doing this, because we're going to be working with a throttle body that has sensors on it, is going to be removing the battery, or disconnecting the battery, I should say. And all you need to do that is remove this cover here and loosen this 10mm nut, and then pull the battery terminal off and tuck it down here. That's all I'm going to do. I'm not going to pull the actual battery itself out. So I'm going to disconnect that, and we're going to move on to the actual throttle body replacement process. Alrighty, so our first step in removing the throttle body is going to be to disconnect the intake air inlet tube. So that's this piece right here with the bellows on it. All we need to do that is remove these two clamps, or loosen these two clamps I should say, and the thing will compress and you can pull it off. You're going to need to disconnect this PCV line here, and I believe that is it to remove that part. So I'm going to go ahead and do that and move on to the next step. Alright, so the next thing I'm going to do before I start actually loosening up the throttle body and how it's mounted itself is disconnect as much as I can from it right now. There's going to be two coolant lines underneath that we're going to have to disconnect after the thing is loose, but we can disconnect everything else right now, which is unplugging this connector. All you have to do is push down on the tab and pull. This connector right here, we're going to disconnect. We also want to disconnect from this bracket. To do that, there's this little tab right here. You're going to lift it that direction, pull it off the bracket. I already had that pre-loosened a little bit. And then this connector right here has a tab back here. You push down and pull. We have this connector right here. Similar situation, except you're going to push down towards the front of the connector and pull that out. And then the only other thing that we can disconnect from the throttle body before we loosen it up and flip it over is the throttle cable itself. And what I always do is loosen the nut on this side and lift it out of this bracket, which is part of the throttle body, and then disconnect the cable from here. You're just going to loop it over whenever it's loose, and then it slips out the back side. So there's a little, you can kind of see it right here, little slot and opening right there for the cable and its little end piece to slip out from. At that point, I'm going to go ahead and finish doing that portion of it, and then we'll move on to removing the actual throttle body. Alright, so you can see we have the throttle cable disconnected and it's just hanging out right there. And we're ready to actually remove the throttle body. So we're going to disconnect a couple things in a specific order that I like to do. I've done this many a time for spark plug changes and whatnot, so pretty used to this. We have 4 12mm bolts, one here, one under here, and then 2 up underneath. You can see one of them right here where the socket is. I'm going to loosen those and take those, they're actually studs, take the nuts off the studs. That's going to remove the throttle body support bracket that attaches to the head here. And then what we're going to do is disconnect the throttle body from the throttle body gasket, which is that black rubber spacer right here. And in order to do that, we're going to remove one 12mm nut down here, right in the middle. Hopefully you can see that attached to that stud. And then the 2 12mm bolts, one right there, one right there. Now, at that point, the throttle body can technically slide off, but because of the coolant lines underneath, it's very difficult to do so. Easiest way to get it off is to actually take out that stud. So in order to take out that stud, it's this one right here. You need a little Torx, external Torx E7 socket. Goes right on the end of that stud, and you can remove that really easily. And at that point, the throttle body will just lift off. So I'm gonna go ahead and loosen all of that and get to the point where we are, where we just finished up with that stud pulled out and the throttle body lifted up. show you what hoses we needed to connect, and we should be able to put the new throttle body on at that point, essentially. So should be pretty straightforward. Okay, so you can see the throttle body's kind of flopped down from where it was a little bit before, and I've got everything disconnected. This thing's pretty much ready to remove, other than those coolant lines that I mentioned. So the bracket down here, I just kind of pulled out a little bit and rolled over. I just let it hang from the wiring harness when I'm working on this stuff. And then, like I said, the stud pulled out, no problem. Everything's loose. So at this point, it's going to be kind of hard for me to flip it over with one hand, but I'll try to do it as best I can. You can see we can lift up the throttle body and see underneath here coolant line number 1, and back underneath coolant line number 2. So this line over here, I like to pull the throttle body loose before I pull it, just so I have a little bit more room here, but you can technically pull this line off without the throttle body disconnected. This is the first one I pulled. So this one is easy to get to, and then the other one, we can actually flip the whole throttle body over and get to that one a lot easier at that point. So this one, all you're gonna do is take some pliers, move the hose clamp back, and I have some hose pliers that are kind of circular shaped. They clamp onto the hose, you can wiggle it loose, pull it off. This one's been off a number of times, so it's not gonna be difficult for me to take off. But if you're doing it for the first time, or if your hose hasn't been taken off in quite a while, your hose will kind of be crusted onto that fitting there. And whenever that happens, it's pretty difficult. It can be pretty difficult to get the hose off. So it crusts on kind of with coolant filling up in there and sealing the hose to the actual fitting, and takes a little bit to break loose. But that's where the hose pliers come into play really well. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that off camera again, because I need 2 hands to do that. And I'll show you what the throttle body looks like flipped over once I have this front hose off, so you can get a little better look at the rear one, and we will move forward from there. That's gonna be the last thing we need to take off, and then the throttle body will be off the car at that point. Okay, so you can see we have that one coolant line removed, and then the other one that we were talking about, if we just lift this guy up, we can get to rather easily right under here, and you can see it right there. So 2-hand job for me. Again, not gonna be able to film it, unfortunately, but pretty darn easy to take off once you get this to this point. And once that is removed, the throttle body is entirely free. So I'm gonna go ahead and remove that and pull the throttle body out of the car. We'll talk about what we're dealing with, other items we might want to replace, and then go and move forward with the replacement from there. All right, so just so you can see, we have the 2 throttle bodies here sitting side by side on the workbench. You can probably tell which one's old and new. Old's on the left, new's on the right. And we should be ready to swap in the new one here. You can see, just for reference, so you can see the fitting sticking out in the orientation fully overall. Same deal, haven't taken anything off from the old one, haven't put anything onto the new one. The way that we took it off and the state that I showed in the video is exactly the way that we're gonna put the new one on. We don't need to transfer over any other parts if you're replacing a whole throttle body with a brand new one. Can't vouch for what refurbed ones come with. And then if you're replacing individual parts, all bets are off as far as what parts you might need to replace and not replace go. This old one I'm gonna keep as a spare and as a core. So if at some point it needs to be rebuilt, can rebuild it. If this one's to fail in the future. But you can see this old one, very overall well kept versus a brand new shiny new one. There's not a whole lot of difference in terms of how clean it is internally. So no matter how well you take care of stuff, you may still have an eventual failure, and you probably will still have an eventual failure of a lot of these different sensor items and whatnot. So new throttle body, ready to go into the truck, or into the car, I mean. It's gonna be pretty simple. It's gonna be, installation is gonna be the reverse of disassembly. So we're gonna start with putting on that lower coolant line, attaching this one, sliding the clamps back over, and so on and so forth. Realistically, I don't see any point in covering that, since again, it is just straight up the reverse of disassembly. So I'm gonna go ahead and do full reassembly off camera. If there's any points that I need to come back to discuss something, I'll come back to discuss it. Otherwise, we will come back when we're fully reassembled and talk about calibration, or the potential to need calibration. We'll cover that process and cross that bridge when we get there. All right, as you can see, the new throttle body is installed. Everything is tightened down. Torque specs, couldn't tell you off the top of my head. I've done this so many times, I do it by feel at this point. So everything's torqued down to my feel point. I'm gonna paint mark everything whenever I know that everything is good to go and everything is well, just so I know that nothing's loosening over time and have a visual indicator of that. But we're reinstalled, so throttle cable reconnected, vacuum line and everything, and intake reconnected. All the connectors are connected. The coolant lines underneath are connected. All the bolts back in place, the 3 that bolted to this gasket and then the 4 that bolt the bracket on. Everything should be dialed in. The only thing that we haven't put back on is the engine cover. So we should be ready to hook the battery back up. That's still disconnected. And what I'm going to do is hop into the car with an OBD2 scan tool and go look at live data. What I'm going to look at is 2 things. Number 1, I'm going to be checking the throttle position, make sure that stagnant with nothing pushing the pedal and the key on, so the car ready to start but not started. Make sure that it reads the correct value. I'll either mention that later or I'll put the value down in the video description. And the second thing I want to look at, if that's correct, is whether or not the pedal responds as I would expect. So whenever I press the pedal, that it reads the throttle position and sees it responding accurately. So those are the 2 things I'm going to check. Now, if the initial reading is not the correct spec per Toyota spec, what we're going to have to do is adjust the throttle position sensor. The way that you do that, and I'll cover it in more detail if I need to do it, is right up here through these 2 screws. There's 1 screw down here, 1 screw up here. They're JIS type screws, so you do need a special quote-unquote screwdriver, not just normal Phillips one. You'd loosen those 2 screws and move the throttle position sensor around. You can see how this sensor is slotted up here. Now, with these being paint marked and everything, my hope is that this thing just drops in and is at the right value, more or less, from the factory. If it is, we should be good to go. If it's not, then we'll have to adjust. So we'll see where we are with that here in just a little bit. All right, so we're here in the driver's seat of the vehicle with the ignition on. I have not touched the accelerator pedal at this point, where I'm reading the throttle position off with my code scanner. And what we're seeing here is 14.5%. So per what I can find online and in the Toyota service manual, or at least excerpts from it, in this state, without having touched the pedal, but with the ignition on and just reading the throttle position into the code scanner, we should have 14.8% plus or minus 0.8%. So that is a range of 14% all the way up to 15.6%. We're right here in the middle of the range. We're a little towards the lower end, but we're pretty much right there. So it looks like from factory, the throttle body came properly set. Now, what it further says is that if you manually close the throttle plate, is the understanding that I have, which other than reaching through the intake area, I don't know how you do that, or via the accelerator pedal by touching it and opening and closing the throttle. You should be between, I believe it was 10 and 15% at that state. If I touch the pedal here, you probably can't hear it on camera, but you can see I'm holding it down just a little bit of the way, about 1/3 of the way, which is reporting a throttle position of 31.8%. If I let go, it comes down to 12.9%. Back up, 40%, back down, 12.9%. So that 10 to 15% range, this is smack in the middle of that as well. So from what I'm understanding, we should have in this state between 10 and 15%, and in the untouched state where the key is just on, between 14 and 15.6%, which we're at 14.5%. So we should be good to go. Obviously I'm going to judge that based on whenever I first start the car as well. If the idle is not good, if the idle is by percentages probably low, if anything, then we'll have to adjust the sensor from there. But it looks like, at least on an initial look, everything should be within spec, if we're understanding the spec correctly. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is I ran the sensor all the way through the range. You can see I'm pushing down on the pedal nice and slowly. The refresh rate is not the greatest on these older vehicles in general for throttle position and data reporting and data streaming, so it's not super quick, but you can see I'm now all the way to the floor. The old sensor, throughout its entire life, whenever I had checked live data streams, maxed out in the high 70s. This one does too. I assume that's normal. I assume it's normal to not have a throttle position of 100%. So that checks out from how the car was before. And if we come back down the range, I'm coming down a little bit quicker than I went up. Everything comes down to the same values. So it looks like everything is working great. What we're gonna do now is fire the car up, make sure it idles correctly, drive it around, make sure that we're good to go. As long as we are, I'll come back, report back, and if there's no more adjustments we need to make, we'll be done at that point. Okay, so we have the car button back up now. did all the calibration, or rather the lack thereof, because I didn't actually need to do any. Like I mentioned, went through, all the numbers look correct. Started up the car, idled fine, drove it around, drove great, everything's dialed in now. So went ahead and threw the engine cover back on, and at this point, we are 100% good to go on this repair. Pretty simple process to replace the throttle body. Hopefully, if you're doing this job as well, you get lucky and you get a throttle body that's pre-calibrated, basically like mine was. If not, should be a pretty easy procedure, but I didn't need to dive into that, so I'm not going to dive into that in this video. With that, I want to thank you all for watching. Let me know in the comment section down below if you have any questions, and I hope to see you in the next video. Take care.